ESPN lists the Buccaneers as one of the bottom third rosters in the NFL. That and more on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, and welcome into this episode of Locked On Bucs, your daily podcast covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank you for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every day. Don't forget you can subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can follow along on Twitter. I am James Yarcho at JYarcho_Bucs, credentialed member of the media covering your Tampa Bay Buccaneers as deputy editor of SB Nation's BucsNation.com. Here with you every Monday through Friday, along with the everydayers. And for that, I would like to share my appreciation for your continued support of the show. One of the ways you can support the show is become a Locked On Bucs insider. You're going to get news, rumors, updates, general thoughts, one-on-one conversations with me via text message. No ads, no hashtags, no anything like that. Just text conversations. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the link in the show notes to become an insider today. This episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. A mailbag catch-up, including a look at the defense coming up in a little bit. But let's start with a ranking from ESPN that, once again, seems to think that the Bucs are terrible. Because, of course, they do. Mike Clay, Aaron Schatz, and Seth Walder teamed up to make a full ranking of NFL rosters where the top 10 teams were San Francisco, Kansas City, Baltimore, the New York Jets, Detroit, Dallas, Cincinnati, Houston, Buffalo, and Philadelphia. As for the Bucs, they came in 22nd. Yes, 22nd. Their biggest strength was safety, biggest weakness was edge rusher, X factor was offensive line, and non-starter to know was Christian Izien. Let's start with the X factor, where Seth Walder said, quote, outside of Tristan Wirfs, the entire line is either a question mark or a concern. Cody Mauch ranked last among guards in pass block win rate, 85% last season, and Ben Bredeson, 88%, wasn't that much better with the Giants. Luke Goedeke, 86%, was below average in the metric among tackles, and Graham Barton is a rookie. Whether quarterback Baker Mayfield can repeat his 2023 performance may hinge on this group, end quote. Now, wait a minute. Wait just a minute. Goedeke was below average because I seem to remember Goedeke being among the top 25 tackles in the NFL, according to Pro Football Focus, and he and Tristan Wirfs were one of 8 tackle duos to make that list. So where exactly are the metrics that list him as below average? Top 25 would put him above average, considering there are 64 starting tackles in the NFL, and average would be 32nd. But let's move on to non-starter to know being Christian Izien, where Aaron Schatz said, quote, nominally a safety, Izien was Tampa Bay's nickelback for most of his rookie season. He was targeted a ton compared to other nickelbacks, but had a reasonably good charting metrics, including a better than average coverage DVOA of minus 4.2%. What will his role be this season? Is he a depth cornerback, a depth safety, some mix of the two, end quote. Now, Izien is only credited with 4 starts last season, but he took 64% of the defensive snaps and was essentially their top nickel corner. When I think non-starter, I'm thinking about guys like Bucky Irving, Trey Palmer, Servassier Dennis, Anthony Nelson, those kinds of rotational players, right? I mean, this article didn't even have Joe Tryon-Shoyinka listed as a starter. They had Yaya Diaby and Randy Gregory as the starting edge rushers, while having Tavier Thomas listed as a starting corner. And I would say that Thomas is heading into training camp third in a three-man race for starting nickel behind Izzy and rookie Tyke Smith. This continues to prove a couple of things. First, the national narrative around the Bucs comes from a lack of awareness. They don't really pay attention to the Bucs, so they don't really care what they get wrong. The narrative is the offensive line is going to be bad, so they just roll with it. They signed this one guy at corner, and he played nickel in Houston, so we should probably just say that he's the starter. Randy Gregory used to be a Cowboy and a Bronco, so obviously he's going to start at edge rusher, despite the fact that he was MIA at mandatory minicamp with no explanation as to why. It also proves market bias, which is something that I've spoken about on the show quite a few times. Tampa is not considered a big football market. So when Tom Brady left, they stopped paying attention and didn't care about the team. Here are some of the rosters in this article that they had ranked above the Bucs. The Seattle Seahawks at 16, Chicago Bears at 17, Pittsburgh Steelers at 18, Atlanta Falcons at 19, New Orleans Saints at 20, Indianapolis Colts at 21. The Bucs have a better quarterback than all of those teams. Arguably a better receiving core than all of those teams, although Seattle's and Chicago's are both in the running. Those are two excellent wide receiver cores. They have better inside linebackers than those teams, better running back than at least half. We'll see how Bijan Robinson does this year and whether or not Jonathan Taylor and Najee Harris return to form. They definitely have a better safety duo than all of those teams. The best tackle duo among all of those teams, with Atlanta's maybe giving them a run for their money. So how are all of these teams ranked higher than the Buccaneers? Well, Chicago's everyone's sweetheart now that they drafted Caleb Williams, and the Bears, being a historic franchise, the media is trying to speak their meteoric rise into existence. Pittsburgh, same thing. Historic franchise, and the resurgence of Russell Wilson is what they want to see. Atlanta, we talked about it. They're the sexy pick in the NFC South because of the addition of Kirk Cousins and the change in coaching staff. New Orleans and Seattle, I don't get it. Neither one of them has a better top to bottom roster than the Buccaneers. Honestly, you could even make a case that the Bucs have a better overall roster than the 15th team on this list, which was the Jacksonville Jaguars. But Trevor Lawrence got all that money, so they have to get pumped up. And of course, they always play overseas, so we have to build them up for the international audience. Non-belief in Baker Mayfield and Todd Bowles plays into this, to some level as well. People don't know really what to make of either guy. Bowles got the job after he couldn't make things work with the New York Jets, and then his best friend walked away from the head coaching job unexpectedly, and he was promptly promoted to head coach, having won the division 2 years in a row now as the head coach. As for Baker, 95% of the national media was preparing for his career funeral at this time last year. So there's a big part of that contingent that wants the opportunity to say, see, I was right. Baker can't do it. And last year was just a fluke. They're looking for validation rather than reevaluating their takes from 2022 and then before the season last year. But as I've said on the show before, it is what it is. The Bucs like this kind of stuff where they're overlooked, they're underestimated, and they're counted out. When the dust settles and the season ends, the Bucs will be one of the teams still playing in the second week of January, while some of these teams listed ahead of them are sitting at home having missed the playoffs. Going to jump into the chat real quick before we hit that first break. We got Cheekiest Scrub says, hey, I have a friend from Georgia who says the Falcons are going to beat the Bucs. Any honest thoughts on that? I'm a Tampa Bay at heart, so I have nothing but faith in us. Here's my take preseason as of right now. I would say Atlanta is a team that the Bucs are going to split with. I think they go 2-0 against the Panthers. I think they split with New Orleans and Atlanta, so they end up finishing 4-2 in the division. That's my take right this moment, but obviously that can change once we get into training camp. We start to see how this team gels, the improvements, maybe some of the regressions. We have to see how this all plays out. But as of June, I would say split with Atlanta, split with New Orleans, undefeated against the Panthers, 4-2 in the division, probably going to be enough to help push them to first place in the NFC South. Mailbag coming up next, where one of the insiders hits me with part 2 of an earlier question. That is next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, brakes, rotors, and more. Whether you're into speed, you're into power, or you're into style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. It makes the shopping process stress-free, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listener review every single day. Every dayers, make sure you are coming back tomorrow. I'm going to answer a mailbag question about the Buccaneers Ring of Honor. You're not going to want to miss that one. I think we're probably going to go live for that one as well. I would love some live chat interaction talking about the Buccaneers Ring of Honor. Meanwhile, if you want to hear the latest news from around all of sports, you have the NHL awards happening. You have the NBA draft that just wrapped up. You have the NFL, because the NFL never sleeps, and some major news talking about Sunday Ticket that came out on Thursday. And of course, MLB in full swing. But you want to hear more than just the national narratives, and you want the biggest stories without manufactured fake screaming and arguing. Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without the screaming. It is streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Getting caught up on the mailbag from last week before everything at home went absolutely crazy, and then my son and I jetted off to Niagara, New York. But Insider David asked part 2 of my mailbag question: how many points per game will the defense allow this year, with your best guess? So for those that didn't hear it or don't remember, Insider David asked me about a week or so ago what I thought the Bucs offense would average in terms of points per game. And I think I landed on around 24 to 25 and put the over-under on points per game at like 24.5. And that was a 3-point increase over their points per game in 2023. So now he's asking what I think the defense is going to do. So last year, the Bucs defense allowed 19.1 points per game, which was tied for 6th best in the NFL. The Ravens were at the top with 16.5, followed by the Chiefs at 17.3, the Niners at 17.5, the Bills at 18.3, Cowboys at 18.5, and then the Steelers tied with the Bucs at 19.1. That's pretty strong, if we're being honest. And the Saints were right behind the Bucs at 19.2. So don't overlook that defense too much. Part of the reason, cheekiest, that I said that the Bucs will probably split with the Saints. But back to the question, it's going to be a little bit tougher to get this one figured out than I think the offense was, but we need to start somewhere. So let's start with the front and work our way back on the defense. Another year in for Kalijah Kancey would mean an improvement in his game and an elevation in his ability. So he's going to be a little bit better, a little bit more consistent, and hopefully a little less injured. And then there's Vita Vea, who shaved off some pounds, but he's going to be just as effective as always. Logan Hall, still a little bit of a question mark, but then you have some depth there with Greg Gaines coming back. William Golston is back, Mike Green, and then probably Judge Culpepper as some other potential rotational guys. I am going to agree with those ESPN folks that the biggest question for this Bucs team is edge rusher. Yaya Diaby, you expect more sacks and more production and obviously more opportunities as he becomes the full-time starter and not just a rotational guy. Joe Tryon-Shoyinka at this point is what he is. Randy Gregory, no clue what's going on with that guy. Anthony Nelson's probably going to get you a couple of sacks. Marquise Watts is going to get some opportunities, and he is a player that the Bucs coaching staff and front office is really, really high on, but I'm not expecting a massive jump from this group overall, and any increase in production from last year, I think, is probably going to be pretty minimal. Levante David and KJ Britt on the inside, with Servassier Dennis being kind of a wild card as far as his snap counts and impact. He is a playmaker, and he is going to get some chances this season. But overall, I think this inside linebacker unit is solid, and you can expect the same level of play that you got last year. The secondary is where it gets interesting. Jamel Dean, Zion McCollum, I talked about them at length on Monday and Tuesday, so you all know where I stand with them. McCollum has to take another big step forward in his development. Dean has to return to his 2020 and 2021 form if he's going to survive the season as a starter and then not get shown the door come March of next year when the Bucs can get out from under that contract if he is not performing the way he needs to. This is a talented group, along with Christian Izien and Tyke Smith, and then you have Hall, and you have Tavier Thomas. Tyreek Funderburk is really starting to make some noise already coming out of mandatory minicamp and heading into training camp, and he might just make this roster as an undrafted free agent. And then as far as safeties are concerned, the Bucs have the best duo in the league. The addition of Jordan Whitehead alone, I think, is good for a full 1 point per game improvement over last season. But the question remains, how much will the edge rush and cornerback play cut into that 1 point that I think Whitehead is good for? 19.1 points per game allowed is good. There's no question about that. I think the Bucs are looking at about 18.5 points allowed this coming season, or at least that's where I stand as of this moment. Once training camp rolls around and I can get a better look at how some of these question marks are performing, yeah, I might adjust that a little bit. But of course, training camp and the regular season are two very different animals. So it's going to be a couple of weeks into the year before we really start to see how the edge rotation really gels, how Zion and Jamel are performing as the 1 and 2 corners, who emerges as that starting nickel, if there's anybody on that short leash. 18.5 would put the Bucs 5th as far as the best scoring defense last season. So that's a 1 spot improvement. But if the offense is averaging 23, 24 points per game, only allowing 18.5 is going to lead to a lot more wins than losses come season's end. The defense's ability to stop teams will rely heavily on that edge rush and on Dean and McCollum, but Bowles is still going to manufacture pressure from other places. But those two corners, absolutely, without question, have to step up and be forces on this defense, because there's only so much that Antoine and Jordan can do on the back end as that safety duo. Going to jump into the chat again real quick before we hit the next break. Cheekiest in the chat again. I might go to the training camp July 25th. I hope you do. I think that would be awesome. It's going to be a great time. I will not be there. In fact, July 25th is not only my wife's birthday, but it's also when I'm going to go see the Foo Fighters in concert in Cincinnati. That was her Christmas gift to me. So it was like, Merry Christmas, hon. Also, you're not going to see me on my birthday because I'm giving you these tickets for Christmas, but I'm super excited to go to that show. But if you can make it, I absolutely recommend being able to go and check out training camp. It really is a lot of fun. We got Mike in the chat saying, "What's up, crew?" We got Richard in the chat. Good evening, everyone. Happy Thursday. Stu in the chat. He predicts 16.5 points per game allowed by the defense. That would have made them the number one scoring defense in the NFL last year. That would be huge. If they're allowing fewer than 17 points per game, we are talking about a 12-win football team this season. That's going to be a really tough mark to hit when you're facing teams like the Eagles, like the Chiefs, like the San Francisco 49ers. You know, they have a rough start to that schedule. So by the time they hit the bye week, you know, the Bucs could be allowing, 20.5, 21 points per game if things aren't going well. But then the second half of that season, it really starts to ease up and they get some really, really favorable matchups and can really bring that average down. We got Lakita says, "Wish I could, but it's 12 hours away." I mean, I'm 14 hours away. I'm too old now. I got to cut that drive into 2 days anymore in my advancing age. A fantasy Bucks question rolls in. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. Wrapping things up here on the Locked On Bucs podcast, and another mailbag question from Insider Gabe. And he asks, "I'm getting ready for my first fantasy league draft, and I was wondering which Buccaneers would you take in your draft, and which ones would you stay away from? Which one should I make sure I get?" So this is another question that's kind of tough to answer, but I will do my absolute best. And a lot of this hinges on what kind of league that you're in. Is it a point per reception, half point per reception, no points per reception, 4-point quarterback touchdowns, 6-point quarterback touchdowns? There's lots of variables at play here, but I'll tell you the order in which I think Bucs players should be taken and kind of give you my top 5. And as crazy as it sounds, the first Bucs player that should be taken in fantasy drafts is Rachaad White. There aren't too many running backs that get as many snaps as he does that are also dual threats. If you're in a PPR or a half-point PPR, Rachaad is going to easily finish as an RB1 this year. And for those that aren't familiar, an RB1 basically means he finishes within the top 12 running backs in the NFL. So based on the sheer volume of carries and targets that he gets, he is going to be a major fantasy player, this upcoming season. Last year, he was the Bucs' leading rusher and third leading receiver. He's the guy that you want, and I would take him in the late second round, maybe even the early third if he slips that far. There are going to be players taken ahead of him based on name value, not production value. So you'll get a steal around that second, third round wheel. Next up, it's Chris Godwin. And that's no disrespect to Mike. So don't yell at me in the chat quite yet. But you're going to get Godwin at bargain basement value compared to the capital that you're going to spend on Mike. Again, if you're in a PPR league, Godwin's return to the slot is going to be huge for his fantasy production. He's going to rack up 90-plus receptions, probably eclipse 1,000 yards. The question is the touchdowns. Can he get in the end zone this year? Even if he doesn't, even if we're talking about the same number of touchdowns as he had last season, the sheer volume of receptions throughout the year is going to almost make up for that. And when he's currently going in the 7th round of fantasy drafts, he's an absolute steal. I love Evans, but Godwin is the play in most drafts. Third is, of course, Mike Evans. You know what you're getting. You're getting 1,000 yards, probably double-digit touchdowns or close to, but you're also spending a 3rd-round pick on him. One of the big knocks on Evans that he's never led the league in receptions or yards in a season, and I will use that against him in fantasy drafts. When you can get players like Godwin 3 or 4 rounds later with similar production, you do that. I like to load up on running backs early because once you get past that top tier of receiver, Tyreek Hill, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra, then you're pretty much drafting the same players for the next 2 to 3 tiers. If I have Evans and Rashad both staring me in the face at the 2-3 turn, I'm taking Rachaad White. Now, let's say you have the number 1 pick and you take Christian McCaffrey number 1, then you're on the 2-3 wheel and you can get someone like Saquon or Josh Jacobs to be your second running back. And then with that 3rd round pick, you can lock up Evans as your wide receiver 1. That's solid. That's a great move because you know you're going to get consistency out of him when he's a locked and loaded starter every single week. But if you go receiver early, don't spend that draft capital on Mike Evans. Save it for 3 or 4 rounds later and get Chris Godwin instead, especially in a PPR. Fourth, it's Baker Mayfield. This is a pick where you're likely going to be playing the matchups and you're going to have to carry another quarterback, but Baker is going to give you some really good games. If you're the type that loads up on receivers and running backs and doesn't take a quarterback until you've reached like the 10th round or later, Baker is a really solid pick. You can pair him with like a rookie like Jaden Daniels or maybe Anthony Richardson, who's coming off of an injury and a lot of people still really aren't sure what to make of him. You're going to have a really, really good combo that you can start either guy any week based on their opponent. So I'm a quarterback by committee guy. I don't usually spend the draft capital that you need for a Josh Allen or a Jalen Hurts or a Patrick Mahomes or those level of quarterbacks. I would definitely target Baker in like the 10th or 11th round, especially if I got Evans early or if I got Godwin so that I have that stack, but then I pair him with a Jaden Daniels, with, another one of these quarterbacks where I can play the matchups and really take advantage. And then finally, I'm going to say either Jalen McMillan or Bucky Irving. And the strategy here is that either one of these guys should be available in your last 2 to 3 rounds. And they aren't going to do much for you right out of the gate, but they could be really sneaky starts later on. If you've got Rashad, you want to take Bucky in the 15th or 16th round as your handcuff, as your insurance, just in case something happens with Rashad. But he's also going to be a viable flex option by time midseason rolls around. As for McMillan, he'll start to have an impact sooner than later, and you aren't going to want to spend half of your fab or burn your top waiver priority for a guy that you should have taken late in the draft because you know that he's going to be a factor in this Bucs offense. Because once you actually decide to make that move to go after McMillan, it's going to be too late. He will have already produced, and other teams in your league are going to be going after him as well, and that's going to raise the price. So just grab one of those 2 guys late in your draft, stash them at the bottom of your bench for a few weeks, and then watch it pay off down the stretch. Going to jump into this chat one more time before we get out of here. Fausto says, I want Evans, Godwin, and Rachaad White and the Bucs defense for a standard PPR league. I am a huge proponent of no more than 2 players from one NFL team on my fantasy roster, because then you're putting too much stock into one team. And if that team has a bad week, you're going to lose your fantasy matchup. So, if I'm going to target 2 Buccaneers, I want Rachaad White, I want Chris Godwin. Those are my 2 that I'm going to target, but I would take any combination of those 4 in my league. I will not go more than 2 players from any one NFL team. We got Richard that says Evans, Godwin, and Rachaad White for fantasy. Al Bundy in the chat says, I would go Evans, then Rachaad White. Not sure I would go Godwin this year. That's a hot take. That is definitely a hot take, Al. I think Godwin is going to look more like 2020, 2021 Godwin this year than he has in 2022 or 2023. Liam Cohen's offense, Godwin in the slot, I think he's going to have a major season, but we'll see how that plays out. Fausto says, I'm also targeting Cade Otton this season. I thought about that. You all know I'm a Cade Otton guy. He, to me, is more of a waiver wire pickup on a bye week. I don't know if I'm going to spend draft capital on Cade Otton this year. I don't know if he's going to get the volume to make it worth it as far as tight ends. And I typically only carry one tight end on my roster at a time. And then when bye week rolls around, I'll pick a guy up. Tyler says that Baker Evans stack, though. Yeah, it's so good. It's so good. But again, I'm not sure if I want to spend that capital. Al Bundy with a quick follow-up says McMillan will take from Godwin. I think Godwin does the same as he did last year, even though he is going to be in the slot more this year. That could be a valid point for sure. I still think there's enough to go around. Again, you go back, Rachaad White was the third leading receiver on this team. Cade Otton was the fourth leading receiver on this team. There's enough there for everybody to eat. Maybe it brings Mike Evans' numbers down a little bit. I still think, we're talking 1,100 yards and probably 8 or 9 touchdowns. But, Evans' numbers come down a little bit. Godwin's numbers go up a little bit. And then all of a sudden McMillan in the mix. And you could have a much more productive offense than you did last year. We could be talking about 4,500 yards for Baker Mayfield instead of just over 4,000. And then Tyler says, we're different fantasy players, James. Indeed we are. But everybody has their strategy and their plan. And I certainly respect all of that. But that is going to do it for this episode. Please check out everything going on over at BucsNation.com. Follow on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs. Become a Locked On Bucs insider. Go to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnBucs or click the show notes or click the link in the show notes. Make sure you're subscribed on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, and come back tomorrow. We're talking Ring of Honor. We're going to go live. I want to see the live chat going nuts for this Ring of Honor discussion. But again, thank you to all that participated in the live chat. You guys have been great as always. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. Want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.